All right. So this morning we are hosting part 5 of our community collaboration series here at the John Crosland School. And we are lucky to have Sydney Bassard with us from the Listening SLP. So she's going to be talking this morning about communicating with children who have language or auditory processing difficulties, really kind of talking through that from her experience. So at this time, I will stop presenting, and Sydney, you can take the reins.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to be talking about communicating with children who have language processing or auditory processing difficulties. So Carrie did a great job. So just so everybody knows, my name is Sydney Bassard. I received both of my degrees from the University of South Carolina. So my bachelor's is in public health, and then I got my master's in speech language pathology. I have two kind of big clinical focus areas. One is dealing with children, but really all individuals with hearing loss. And then the other one is literacy. And we'll talk a little bit about how auditory processing and language processing kind of plays into those different areas. I love to collaborate with researchers, so very actively involved with investigating outcomes for children with hearing loss, as well as looking at their language and literacy abilities. And then I run the Listening SLP on all social media platforms. We do a lot to really help promote health equity of information on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So just giving kind of a brief overview of what we're going to talk about so far is how we auditory process information. What exactly is auditory processing disorder? Characteristics of auditory processing disorder. What actually is the difference between language processing and auditory processing? And then we'll be wrapping up by sharing some tips from home and school. So kind of digging right in, how do we auditory process information? So a lot of times people will be like, okay, well, you heard that, which is great. Like that's kind of the first step is that detection. But what does this actually mean? So for us to auditory process information, we have to have that ability to interpret the sounds that one's heard. And so when we think of that on like a small scale, if we hear the sounds s, t, ah, our brain is automatically mapping that to stop. Everything that I'm saying as I'm talking right now, your brain is having to process it in order to take in these words to make sense of exactly what I'm saying. So when we're auditory processing information, it requires that we are preserving what we heard, that we're refining the things that we've listened to, we're analyzing it within our brain. If we have to modify what we heard at all, we're doing that, organizing it into different categories for how we process language, and then we're also interpreting that information as well. Because we have to know what's being said to us. So we're going to think of an example that kids might experience or that we might use when talking with kids. So we might say like, go get your blue shoes. And we would think as adults that that's a pretty simple command, go get your blue shoes. But for a child who's having difficulty with processing information, that's actually could be a complex direction. So not only is it just the go get your shoes, but they're having to like think in their head, okay, where are my shoes in relationship to me? When am I supposed to go get my shoes? Not only is it just shoes, but you've added what we call a critical element. So a critical element could be color, could be size, could be quantity, could be location, but all of that adds a little bit of complexity to just like this one step direction. So we've added the complexity of blue. So as you can see, it's not just, oh, you heard that, you should be able to follow through, but our brain is really having to map all of this information from beginning to end to complete even what we would consider a pretty simple command or direction. And so, how do we use auditory processing, like the ways that we use it? So, we talked a little bit about auditory discrimination up front, and that's just being able to distinguish between the sounds to help understand words and phrases. And when we're talking about sounds, we're talking about speech sounds, or we can also call those phonemes. And so, that was in that first example of you have to be able to hear the differences between s, t, ah, in order to know that that word is stop. Sometimes, if we have kids who have troubles with articulation, we might go back and start with some discrimination between the sounds. Do you hear the difference between sh and ch? Do you hear the difference between b and p? And then we also might do some strategies for them to use like lip reading or some like tactile cues of like voice boxes, different things to help them to know. Because if you're missing those sounds within words, when you're trying to put them together as to the whole word and in a direction, you could be vastly off as to what you're doing. If you hear go get your bat when really someone said go get your cat, you're missing the direction. And we might think like, oh, that sounds small, right? But when we're thinking of whole skill instruction, when kids are learning and listening throughout the day, those are lots of like little things that are going to be build to like bigger issues and processing listening challenges throughout. And then second one we have is temporal processing. And when we think of temporal, we can kind of think of it as time. It refers to the brain's ability to perceive and process time-related information, such as the duration and the order of events. And it involves various cognitive processes include attention, memory, perception, that allow us to kind of make sense of the world around us over time. So think about the same example of if we say like, go get your blue shoes, but what if we say, go get your blue shoes after you put on your coat? Okay, now we've added a temporal piece to it. So a kid has to understand, like, yes, I'm going to get my shoes, but it's after I'm doing something else. This is generally why we might see kids that have difficulties with auditory processing struggle a lot too with following directions because they're having to not just hold on to the directions they're supposed to do, but if we have any type of additional information in there, but also when they're supposed to do it, or as we know, sometimes educators or parents might give like 3 or 4 instructions before a task starts, and a child is having to hold on to all of those. That can be kind of difficult. And then we have binaural processing. And so when you hear binaural, I want you to think like 2 ears are better than one, meaning like listening for our both ears is better than if we just had one ear at all. But when we think about the processing for binaural integration, it's how the brain uses the information it receives from both ears to understand and locate sounds within the environment. So that's that localization. Where is the sound coming from? Oftentimes, if like you hear a fire truck kind of driving on the road, what's the first thing that you do? You kind of sit there and listen a little bit, but then your eyes and your body starts adjusting to where you think you hear the sound coming from so that you can make a decision. It's the same thing when we're thinking about information that we're hearing, excuse me, information that we're hearing within any type of environment. We're listening through both of our ears, but we're able to kind of adjust and make that um, adjustment so that we're taking in all of that information. But it also deals with the process of competing noise or when we have acoustic signals that are coming from different places. Think about how many times, and I am totally guilty of this, that I sit at home or I'm in the car and I have music going on, but I also have someone trying to have a conversation with me. Or what I do a lot of times when I'm in my home office is I have like the TV on in the background, but I'm also trying to work on something else or listening to something else. That can be a lot of auditory information, but it happens to us all the time. And when we have good binaural integration skills, what we're able to do is kind of know how to tune one of those things out and tune our mind into the thing that we should be focusing on. When you have challenges with auditory processing, that can be a little bit difficult to be able to know how to distinguish the message I should be hearing when I have another message coming in on a different side. Oops. Okay, so now we're gonna watch a video. Um, and this video is from, oops, sorry, okay, there we go. So we're gonna watch this video, and this video is from Dr. Alexandria. So she went to school in Kansas here in the US, and then she now works in New Zealand. I actually had the pleasure of meeting her at our like American Speech Language Hearing Association conference in November this past year. But she does a lot of work specifically looking at auditory processing. She's helped create like a program essentially that you can help to work on these oral rehabilitation skills with individuals. But I really like the way that she kind of breaks down and explains auditory processing. So now that we've talked about how we process auditory information, let's talk about what it looks like when we're struggling with that. And if you want, her whole TED Talk is on YouTube. We are not going to watch all of it, but we're going to watch a little bit of it this morning together.
Sydney, we can't hear the video.
Okay, let's see if we can fix that real quick. Um, what about here? Let's try it this way and see if you're able to hear it. Okay, what about and we'll pull back up that other one in a second.
Yes, we got it now.
Were you able to hear that? Okay,
Yep.
perfect. So we'll just
Thank you.
play it on this screen. Oh, thanks for letting me know that. I think we were like right here.
The work I would do the rest of my life, and the wonderful Jack Katz became my mentor. This is what he taught me. Auditory processing is what the brain does with what the ears hear. When there's an error with auditory skills, it's called an auditory processing disorder. Therefore, APD is a hearing disorder that has less to do with the ears and more to do with the brain. There are 100 of us in this room, and that means that if we represent a general population, at least 6 of you know this disorder because you have lived it. But rates are even higher in the most marginalized and vulnerable people. For example, research at the University of Auckland suggests that up to 35% of Pacific Island children have this difficulty, partially due to the high rates of middle ear disorders during early childhood. If a child is learning speech and language through fluid in the middle ear space, the brain receives a distorted version of speech sounds. Rates are also higher in other populations, and it co-occurs with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, brain injury, and emerging data suggests that there's high rates in the prison population. If you have ever traveled to another country where they speak a different language, you may know how this feels. When the plane lands, you may be aware that people are speaking to you, but until you can process what they say, it can be frustrating, it can be confusing, it can be isolating. Now imagine having that same feeling in your own language. When you struggle to hear and understand, you struggle to feel heard and understood. Now let me take you on a journey to understand how auditory skills are supposed to be.
Okay. So that's just her kind of giving us a brief overview as to what APD is. And I loved that she started with kind of giving that definition, but then also talking about some of the challenges that people might face and how it impacts what I would consider your livelihood. We oftentimes think of these skills really related, especially when kids are younger, into academic settings, but we don't think about how this impacts them socially, and then thinking about like the emotional components about not feeling heard, not being able to really process or participate in conversation the way that you may want to. So, kind of expanding a little bit on what she talked about, and this is coming from Nationwide Children's Hospital, kind of a working definition, but it's really thinking about not being able to fully understand what's being heard. But we want to be clear that APD is not a form of hearing loss. So, when you go to an audiologist, that's the only person who is licensed to make these types of diagnoses. They'll do a full hearing assessment first just to make sure that there is no underlying hearing loss there. And then they'll run through a battery of different tests that look at your ability to hold on to information auditorily, look at your ability to be able to listen, like we said, to different pieces of information, being able to repeat it, looking at some of those auditory discrimination tasks, being able to repeat words that you've heard back, all within the presence sometimes of background noise, and then they're calibrated so that we're getting consistent results across people. So before we jump in a little bit more to some of the characteristics of APD and what this looks like, I always like telling people about the auditory hierarchy and what exactly that is. So a lot of times I'll have people that come into the office and they say like, well, my child can hear just fine. Like they hear me just fine. It's selective listening. And I know that I've been guilty of kind of using those terms too before I knew a little bit better. But this is how we can think of these things. So first we have detection tasks. And this is going up the ladder from most basic all the way up to complex. And this is based on Erb's listening hierarchy. So detection is just awareness that a sound is present or not present. We generally see babies do this, right? When a newborn is born, if they hear like the doorbell ring, they'll kind of look up. When the first time they start hearing their parent or caregiver's voice, they just kind of look around the room. They're not able to make sense of the fact that you are talking to them or that that's the sound of the doorbell or the kitchen timer. But what they do know is that they heard a sound. They know that there's some type of sound stimulating that auditory system for them. Then we have discrimination. So that's kind of that next step up. Okay, so now you are able to not only know that there's a sound, but distinguish between two different sounds. You either know that they're the same or they're different. We see this a lot of times as kids get older, like they're able to be able to do this in production of speech sounds. So our s sound isn't sounding like our z sound, or our t sound isn't sounding like our s sound. They're being able to understand that those are completely different sounds and they have to in order to be able to accurately produce them. Then we get into identification. So you're not only able to like detect, discriminate, but you're able to identify like what that sound is or what's being labeled. You know that that's the doorbell sound. If someone is giving you directions, you're able to accurately identify the different components of what they're talking about within that direction. And then last, which is the most complex, is comprehension. And so sometimes if we have kids that struggle with any of those three underneath, we definitely are going to see it impacted with the comprehension component. They're not able to fully understand and process what's being said to them in order to complete the action that's desired. So these are a lot right here, but these are just some characteristics and things that we see of individuals who might be struggling with APD. discriminating between those sounds and words. And I would say that it's not just one of these things, but generally a combination of a couple of them. And it's important to note too that it is comorbid a lot of times with dyslexia or ADHD or other type of learning challenges or medical diagnosis that a kid might have. We might see challenges with that reading and spelling, in addition to trying to learn a foreign language. Listening in noisy environments. We oftentimes see that, especially when it comes to social interactions. If people are trying to talk to multiple people at once, like I said before, if we have like that kind of music going on in the background, if we have the TV going on, but then think about this in the school setting, right? We know that sometimes classrooms can tend to be a little bit noisy, whether if it's by chatter going on, sometimes if there's like air conditioning going on, but then think about the lunchroom too. It's a natural time in which kids are chatting and wanting to engage with each other socially. But if you're having a difficult time being able to tune out that background noise, to tune into conversation, or if it's competing noise of multiple people talking at the same time, that can be a real challenge for you. Being able to hold on and remember that spoken piece of information, following along with long conversation that someone's having, especially if people are consistently changing the topic from one thing to another, you might not be able to hold on to it. Following those multi-step directions, as we said at the beginning, even if we have a one-step direction, but we add those cues of color, we add different adjectives, quantity, amount, locations, that's even making our one-step direction more complex. Maintaining that focus when we have other sounds that are present, and then even it all the way trickles down to being able to take those written notes from speech. So, like with most things, APD is a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. There's some people who are mildly impacted by it. And so I just put on here some graphics of some of the things that we talked about that might be a challenge, whether it's the processing of sounds, following directions, attention, conversation, note taking, or listening and background noise. And then we also know there's some people who are severely impacted, where their day to day functioning is really, really difficult for them because they're not able to process kind of the world around them. So, is it language processing or is it auditory processing? How do we know? And I'd love to tell you, like, oh, we can tease them out by looking at these different characteristics. But the reality is that they're tough to tease apart because they involve each other. The language system, especially the spoken language system, heavily involves auditory based skills. So you can't necessarily completely tease them out from one another. But I do think it's important whenever we're looking at someone who has auditory processing disorder that we also kind of look at their language structures as well. So, language processing involves that ability to understand and produce language, including spoken and written words. And it really involves complex set of cognitive processes. So that includes phonology, and we can think of phonology as like our speech sounds. Those are the sounds that make up the language that we're using. And when we're talking about language processing, I do want to make this caveat. We're not just talking about English language. So if you do have a child that speaks two languages or they're learning multiple languages, these are the structures that all spoken languages follow. So, like I said, we have phonology. We can think of those as the speech sounds, the way that we organize those sounds together in order to form words. Then we have semantics. A way to think about that is like vocabulary, but that's the meaning associated with words or phrases and how we have them. So if you can see in our little graphic here, we have these are all what we would call a hat, right? But as our system gets more sophisticated, we know that like one is a sun hat, one is a baseball cap, and then the other we might call like a beanie, or depending on you where you live, some might call it a toboggan. Then we also have syntax. So that is the way in which we put words together. We can also think of that as grammar. Prosody, it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. So it's that expression component to language. and then morphology as well. And so that's looking at adding those word parts. So whether we're adding something to make it past tense or whether we're adding something to show plurals or present progressive, those are all encompassing. As I stated at the onset, language processing relies on the auditory system to perceive and process the speech sounds and the information that we're hearing in order to do any of these different things. Auditory processing, though, refers to the brain's ability to process sounds and recognize them as meaningful information. We've all heard, like kind of those silly sounds, or sometimes when a kid goes into the auditory booth, they have what they call warbles. So it's just kind of like a bunch of noise that's been compiled together. We know that that doesn't really hold any meaning, but the speech components we know do hold meaning, and that's what helps us later on with our language processing skills. So this really involves the ability to discriminate between different sounds, identify their source and location, and then integrate that auditory information with other sensory input. And this is really important for a wide range of tasks, such as listening to music, understanding speech in noisy environments, and then even being able to detect those warning signals that we talked about. So now we're going to jump into the fun part and talk about tips for school and home. So we'll start with school. So what are the key tips for here? One is sit in an optimal location. And the reason that I used optimal location is because a lot of times we'll hear the term preferential seating. And so what does preferential seating mean? Sometimes that means that you are sitting dead front in the center of the room because that is where the teacher or who your instructor is really spends the majority of their time in the classroom, is right there in the front. Other times, that's not true. A lot of times, people now, as they are teaching or engaging students in their learning, they might be walking around the classroom. So, what you want is for your child to sit in a location where they can hear the teacher's instructions and lessons clearly, no matter what point in the room that they're coming from, that they also have visibility to the board as well. We can use assistive technology. So assistive technology can look a little bit different for some people, but we have FM systems that can be used, personal amplifiers as well. There are some people who benefit and have opted to provide their child with a hearing aid for their auditory processing challenges. And that can help your child just kind of boost that sound that we want to hear and process the information in the classroom better. There's other technology out there that's not the ones that I mentioned. I've been working with somebody recently that we've talked about the use of AirPods. They have something called Live Listen, which can also be great for this, but then you have to compete with, like, is the child actually using the live listen function? Or are they listening to music? But that's something to explore before spending money on technology, just to kind of see if, like, there's some lower cost options before, like, diving into something that might cost a little bit more. Using visual aids is so important. So whether it's diagrams, it's pictures, it's videos, really help reinforce that auditory information that's used. Picture schedules can definitely also be really helpful to help guide kids along what they're supposed to be doing. As kids get older, so we know for kids that are small, right, like, note taking is not necessarily a priority. But as kids get older, like, encouraging more of that note taking to really help them remember those key pieces of information, but not taking notes on the computer. So I know that a lot of us love our technology. It definitely makes it easy, but there is science that talks about the uh, pros of handwriting. So making sure that we're writing down this information and not just typing it is going to help to not only keep it in our brain longer, but reinforce those auditory processing skills. And then something that goes along with whether it's note taking or anytime directions are being given, having your kid kind of have a way that they feel comfortable to ask for a repeat if necessary. And that kind of goes into our last point here of breaking down those complex instructions. So when we give instructions, a lot of times we tend to rush through 3 or 4 items. But if we know that someone's having difficulty with auditory processing, and fun fact, this is good for all kids, not just ones that have difficulty with processing. We want to break those instructions down into smaller, more manageable steps that they can clearly see the connection and they're able to work through that process instead of 4 or 5 items at a time. And then also too, we want to think about having the kids repeat instructions back to us. So not just letting them uh, us give all of these informations and then expecting them to do it, but we can always say like, okay, so like, what did we hear? You tell me what's first, what's second, what's third, what's fourth. This not only helps the kid to like hold on to the information auditorily a little bit longer, but it helps cut down on some of the frustration on their end for when they accidentally do something they weren't supposed to do yet, but also the frustration sometimes we experience as adults when we think that a child is not listening to us or following the directions that we asked them to. And then tips for home. So we know that kids spend a lot of time at school, and that's great, but they also spend a lot of time at home and with their families. So what does that look like? Reduce the background noise. Like I said, I'm guilty of this myself. I love having the TV on or music on or something going on while I'm trying to communicate, but that can be really, really challenging. So making sure that we either like cut those things off when we are having important conversations or providing direction or engaging the child at all, or we keep it like really minimal in the background because it can make it a lot more difficult to focus on what you're trying to say to them if we have all of that noise going on in the background. Face each other when talking. I think we're all guilty, right, of trying to talk from 3 or 4 rooms away or yell from upstairs to downstairs. And then what do you get a lot of? Huh? What? I didn't hear that. Or the person just completely ignores you. So making sure that you're in the same room, you're having that face to face, so that we know that our attention is zoomed in on what's being talked about. Just like at school, using visual aids at home are always going to be helpful, whether that's gestures, whether that's written words that you're having out to reinforce what you're supposed to do, whether that's even pictures, whatever kind of visual aid system that works for you is best, is always encouraged and kind of adds that reinforcement. Practice active listening. So you might be thinking about like, why did you put active in quotations? And it's because we can be listening, right? Detecting information, but are we actively engaged in what's going on and what we're hearing? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So really encouraging your child to actively listen and engage with information they hear. Ask questions, have them summarize what they heard, and then even repeat some of that information back to you. That lets you know what parts of what you said they were really tuned into, and then what parts might require a little bit of repetition on your end. You can play some listening games, like Simon Says or I Spy. Those can be a little bit more silly to just kind of encourage those auditory skills. And then the last one is reading out loud. So, reading out loud to your child can improve their auditory skills as they have to listen and process the information in real time. And then think about too, if you want to take reading aloud and move it back into like more of that academic mindset, what happens all the time? Kids are expected to read stories or they listen to stories and then they are asked questions about what happened. So if we kind of practice those skills at home, plus we know the benefits of reading out loud as far as exposing kids to complex language and vocabulary building as well. So we're working on a lot of different skills all at once. Okay, and with that, we have reached the time for questions. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they want to know more about?
And feel free to unmute. There is also like a Q&A chat that you can utilize if you are not in the position to unmute or don't feel comfortable doing that.
And we'll give it a second. But while people are thinking of questions, if they have any, I just want to thank you guys all for being here this morning. We know it was a struggle. It was a struggle for me as well, especially with the time change happening over the weekend. But if you want to stay connected or talk about any of these things more, you can always find me on social medias, like I said, at the Listening SLP on Instagram or Facebook. Please feel free to email me at hello@thelisteningslp.com. And you can always go to our website where we house a bunch of free downloadable handouts and infographics for consumption. So
And I have to
thank
just say
you.
that Sydney's Instagram is one of my favorite resources to follow. Like, she's always got super interactive and easy to follow visuals and things. So even just following her on Instagram, me personally, I really enjoy that. So thank you, Sydney.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. I really appreciate that.
Well, Sydney, I want to thank you so much, just from personally the John Crosland School, for you sharing with us today. Like you said, even though it was a struggle this morning for, I think, lots of people to get up, still doing so, and presenting all this really valuable information and sharing your contact information. We just really appreciate just helping get some of that information out there to those who are trying to learn more or just understand more of what their child is going through. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.